Making the leather key case is one of the more simple leathercraft projects we can do, though we do get to practice some basic skills. This is a basic pattern I created recently, which seems to work quite well. Thought I'd share it with you. So let's go and have a look at how it's made. Okay, so for this key case I'm going to be using J.H.leather. That's about 1.5 to 1.8 mils in thickness. It works about around that thickness, works quite well for this type of thing. I've got a template which I'm developing at the moment. So you can see there's a few different markings and scratchings on it. I've pretty much settled on how it's going to work. I've built a couple of key cases already and it works quite well. Eventually I'll make up one that's nice and clean, but for the time being this works quite well. So what I'll do is I'll take a scratch awl and we'll mark this off. I like to really scratch that in quite fairly deep, not too deep. You don't have to press too hard. But I like to get a really nice defined marking for the pattern to cut against. And there, that's quite easy to do. Next step is to actually cut that out. Okay, so let's cut this out. I'm going to use what's known as a pattern knife to do that, at least for the straight edges. There's 3 straight edges on this and then 1 curve, as you would have seen on the pattern. 3 straight edges to curve there, which I actually made that with a French curve template. Very handy to have in the workshop, a French curve templates. So anyway, I've got one edge here which I can cut straight up against. I'll then just roughly cut this out, and once I've got that basic part out, I will then cut those straight edges and the curve separately. So let's do this particular straight edge first. This tool here allows me to cut in a straight line. It's designed that way. It's a very good tool, very sharp. You can just use a ruler like what most people would do, and I do that sometimes as well. You can just use a ruler with whatever blade type knife you like to get a nice straight cut. So let's get this started. So that's a nice straight edge there. These I don't want to cut in this position, so I will just cut wide of it, wide of the next cut. Leave about 1 centimetre or so. I'm just really going to cut this piece out. And just a few fibres on that edge there. And that's out. So I'll put this main piece of hide away, and then we'll get this cut out accurately. Okay, so we've got one edge there, one straight edge on that side. I'm going to cut those 2 out, and then we'll do the curve with a different blade. That'll make it a little bit easier. So that's one done. That's another one. Now I'm going to take this particular blade knife that I like to cut curves with. If you don't have something like that, you can just use a typical blade knife that most people have around the house in the workshop. Just make sure it's sharp. If you've been using it for various other things, just get on a strop, give it a bit of a sharpen, and it'll work quite fine. And take your time. So let's get this curved end done. Okay, and there we have it. Just a bit of a curve. That's ready for the next step. Let's do that. Right, now this next step, you may or may not do this, probably not. Normally I'd go straight into dyeing at this point in time, actually dyeing the leather. But what I'm going to do is actually wet the leather a bit, because I want to put a couple of stamps, my brand stamp and another stamp in there on this particular piece of leather here. Prior to doing that, I like to actually get some moisture into the leather. So just with a sponge, a bit of water, got some water in a container here. I'm going to wet this leather, and of course, even though we're not stamping the whole area, only putting a couple of small stamps in, we always wet the entire piece of leather. That way we avoid any potential for getting any marks, water marks on one spot and nowhere else. It just doesn't look all that great. So we always apply water to the whole piece, and not too much, just a little bit on the surface. The stamping we're doing is not really too heavy duty, it's quite easy, but just putting that little bit of moisture in will help it get a nice stamp in there. And we'll now leave that for a few minutes, and when it gets back to almost its more natural colour before it was wet, that's when we'll put the stamps in. Okay, so that the leather has dried off a bit. It's getting back to its more natural colour. It's a nice bit of moisture in there ready for stamping. Actually want to get the stamps into the middle, or I guess the middle section. So this template, essentially those are the two fronts that curve round to close, and that part there is effectively what is the back part of the key case, the pouch. So I'm just going to actually use this I've got lines drawn in to those sections, so I'm going to use this to guide me as to where the back is, because that's where I want to put the stamps. The first one is my Handmade in Australia one, my smaller one. I've got a larger one of these. So I've got two small stamps here. Normally on large products I use my large stamps. On smaller products like this I've got smaller versions. And this stamp here, which is CRG, Cool River Goods, just the initials, but I do have quite a large one for large products which has the full Cool River Goods logo on it. So let's just drop these in nice and easy. Just making sure that's centered and straight, and we don't need too much pressure here. It's made quite a good impression. I'll swipe over to the other stamp. And I'm just going to drop this one over the top of that other one, roughly in the middle, as centered as I can get it, nice and straight, so that we're looking good. And that looks very good. So We're going to dye that next. Now, because I've wet that leather a bit, I really want that to dry really well. So I might leave that for at least half hour, probably an hour or more, before I get into the dyeing process. Okay, so I'm over at the dyeing table. I've already dyed this piece of leather. I've dyed the back of it, the rough side, dyed the edges, and of course the top grain. It's a dark brown dye. It'll look quite nice with this type of product. I haven't gone into my dyeing process here. I didn't want to make this video too long and focus too much on the various steps in any sort of detail. I feel it's better that if I make a separate video about how I go about dyeing leather, that would be much better. I can go into a lot more detail that way. So I think that'll be a good subject of a future video. Anyway, this leather's ready for the next step. So we'll get on to that soon. Back at the main workbench area now. We've got that piece of dyed leather, which right now what I want to do is actually prepare it for stitching. Now this is an optional step because you may not necessarily want to stitch this. We're not actually stitching leather where we normally would have, a couple of pieces that we're stitching together to bind those. For this particular product, all we're doing is really creating a decorative stitch, more for aesthetic purposes rather than it actually having any other function. And so it is an optional thing you can or can do if you want to. You don't need to. My feeling is that having stitching round it really does create a more professional, more finished looking product. So certainly well worth doing. Now, when we dyed this leather, what happens to the leather is it actually dries up quite a bit as a result of the dye. Now, we'll address that by conditioning the leather and getting some oil back into it. What I like to do before I do that is actually get my stitching prepared and actually perhaps even done. The reason is if I get oil back into this leather now in an attempt to prepare it for stitching, the edges can become a bit mushy, so you may not get entirely straight stitch lines, and also when you punch your holes for the stitching, it may not be it'll probably be okay, but it potentially won't be as good a result as you might like. So I like to get that ready and done prior to conditioning the leather later on. So what I've got here is just a marker that I'm going to use. I've got it set to a 3mm gap from the edge, and I just give me a nice indentation, a line right around there where I'll then punch my stitching holes. Now you may not have one of those. Most people use one of these wing dividers, which you set to the appropriate gap on the ends that you want, and then use that to mark, because really all we're doing there is scratching the surface of the leather. We're not actually cutting or anything, we're just creating a mark that'll give us a nice straight lines to actually punch our holes into. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to mark it up, so just taking my time and making sure I get it nice and accurate. There we have it. You may or may not be able to see that on camera, but we have our stitching lines marked out around the edges, and that's ready for punching the holes into now, ready for actually doing the stitching itself. Right, so I have here my stitching iron that I've chosen to use for this particular product. They're diamond stitch pattern. They're 4mm spacings because I want to use the thread that's 0.8 millimeters thick, which will look quite nice on this. You could use thinner. I wouldn't go more than 0.8 mil, and that'll provide a nice finish to this particular key case. So I will get these holes done, and typically I like to start. I've got some straight edges. I either start the straight edge, or because we've got a curve here, I like to actually start at the curved part first to make sure that my holes that I want lined up nicely in those corners are right there, and then work my way around. So let's do that now. And for the curved area, I'm using the punch that has 2 prongs, so I can get around that curve nicely and follow the curved line. When I get onto the straight edges, I'll actually go to either the 4 prong or even the 10 prong one there. I think it's 10, might be 8. So that I basically get it done quicker, but also the more prongs you have, the straighter your stitching line is going to be overall. So always use the longest, the stitching line that has the most prongs on it. And it depends what you're doing and the situation. I may well do a specific video at some stage on stitching, including how to get your stitching holes correct so that you can do a good job with your stitching. So that's the first part done on that edge, on the curved edge. Actually lined up quite nicely. It's really important to practice your stitching, especially if you're just starting out. Stitching is one of those things where separates just okay work from the really good work. It's what people really notice, the quality of your stitching. So I always suggest getting that as good as you can. In fact, that's something that you really should practice quite a bit of on scrap bits of leather before you tackle your actual project. Sometimes if you're a bit rusty, it's good to practice on a scrap bit of leather before you get into actually doing it for real. That way you'll do a good job of it. So let's get stuck into the edges now. And so all those holes are in now because the leather was nice and a bit stiff from dryness from the dyeing. Been able to get a nice straight line. We're not getting any mushiness. That'll give us a nice stitch. So that's ready now to put onto the stitching pony. Okay, so we're over at the stitching pony. This is it here. I won't show the whole thing. Suffice to say, it's something I made. You can buy these. If I make a stitching video one day, I'll go through what you require in terms of. You can do this by hand. You can stitch something like this by hand, just on the bench. It's a bit more fiddly. This makes it a lot easier. Anyway, I'm going to place this in here and clamp it in to make it easy to stitch. Now, sometimes it's good to make a choice as to where you start your stitching and where you end. So because this will close, when this closes, and you snap it together as a key case, this edge here will be on the outside. So that's the inside of the case. Therefore, we might as well start the stitching on this edge here, which means we'll finish around this side. And when we do our back stitching to seal it, not that it looks, rough or anything, but you can see that back stitching. We might as well hide it if we can. It's only a minor detail, but all the little minor details count in terms of how well your product looks at the end. So I'll probably start it round about the middle and work my way around. I've already got my 2 needles prepared with stitching thread. I think I'll start it around about there. And you can't see what I'm doing because the thread's a bit long, but I've basically centered so that I've got equal amounts of thread going out to each needle. So what I'll do next is I'll start stitching. Now I'm doing a basic saddle stitch for this, which I won't get into a lot of detail on. Something that really needs to be practiced to make sure you get a good result. I'm just going to work my way around the whole outside edge until I get it all done. So I will continue in that vein. Always like to check my stitching as I go, just in case I've made a mistake or not quite happy with it. I can quickly reverse that and redo it, which is always easier to do it as you go rather than trying to fix that later on. If you've gone way too far, it can be a lot of work to redo it. Okay, so I've stitched right around. I didn't want to bore you with the whole process. I'll skip forward about 10 minutes. Just got a couple of stitches to go before I do my back stitching and complete it. So we'll just do those. With this type of thing, I like to do a couple of back stitches in order to seal that stitch. Pull those tight at the end, behind the face, and I'll be cutting those off. Just trimming it, just leaving small tags around 3mm, 2 to 3mm at the back. You can't see that, but that's what I'll be doing. And then I'll use what's known as a thread zapper to actually melt those tag ends. You can use a cigarette lighter. A lot of people use a cigarette lighter to do this. I like to melt those back. They form little nodes on it's nylon thread, so they form little nodes. You can just give it a bit of rub down with something, flatten it out, and that's sealed. So I've got a nice stitch happening there. You probably won't be able to see it fully on that on the screen, but I'll do a close-up of the stitching. You can see how it works, how it looks when the actual key case is fully complete. What I'll do next is just hammer that stitches down and make them nice and flat and make them lay nice and evenly, and we'll get on to the next stage of the process. Right, so we're back at the main workbench. We've got that nice piece of leather which has been stitched. You can see it's already providing a nice contrast against the leather, that stitching. Gives a nice finish. Look, this piece is going to look so much better when we finish with it. Once we condition it, get some oil back into it, and we've got our hardware on, and it's actually doing what it's meant to do. It's actually going to be quite a nice product that we've made. So what I want to do next is punch my holes for the snaps. Okay, the snaps and also the actual key holder itself. Just 2 holes in it for 2 rivets. There's various types of these. I've got a couple of types in stock here. There's this type, which I kind of like, and there's also a type which is very similar, slightly different shape at the top, more squared off, and it also has a chain which you can then, with a hook, which you can then hook onto a hook in a bag or something like that, so you don't lose your keys in the bottom of a bag, that type of thing. For this one I'm going to use this particular one, and we'll go through that. So first thing I want to do is, on my pattern, I've actually got marked my holes for the actual snaps. Now I've made a few different holes here. I've got a couple in the middle here, which would be if I just want to use one snap, and that works okay. What I find works much better, looks better, and works much better to keep the key case closed a lot not more nicely, is to have 2 snaps. So we're going to mark holes here and here and here and here, so we've got the female and male end of the snaps. So that's the first thing I'll do. I'm just going to use a small scratch awl to do that, just to mark some holes where I'm going to punch, make a mark in the leather where I'm going to punch holes soon. So I'll just do that initially. Make sure I've got the pattern nicely lined up all around the edges. All good. I can mark those in. Okay. So those are marked in, and next I'm going to get ready for punching the holes. So just punching these holes for the snaps. So those are done. Next thing I want to do is punch holes for the actual key holder itself. Now on this template I had marked holes for the other type of key holder I have, which the holes are just slightly further apart. So you don't really need to have these particular holes for these rivets for the key holder on the actual pattern itself necessarily. What I would normally really just need to do, because these could vary, you can get a few different types of these key holders, and that section there where the rivets go, well, that's going to vary in terms of the width and general placement. So it's hard to make a template to suit them all. My suggestion is, if you're going to make this sort of thing, is use this as a guide. Okay, so what I've got marked, what I have marked is 3 different sections here lining up. This goes in the middle, of course, so that middle section. So what I would just do is eye it. By eye is just place that roughly as close as I can get to the middle section, and noting that I've got my stitch line, so I don't want those holes or the actual rivets. I'm going to use rivets which got quite a small cap on them, so I can actually pretty much line up the top of the actual key holder with the top of the edge of the leather, and that gives me a good placement. Then I just make sure that it's centered and straight, and I can mark the middle of those holes. Okay, so that's done. Just like to check that. Like to check it. Always worth checking before you start punching holes to make sure you got things in the right, looks like things are in the right place. To me that looks pretty good, and I think we'll go with that. So I've got my punch here, which is I use 2mm punch for the actual snap holes because they're quite, it's quite a small post in these snaps. I'm actually going to use glove snaps rather than line 16 or line 20 or line 24 snaps, which are way too big. So either line 16 or I've got actual glove snaps here, which are nice smaller type snaps, which look good for this type of product. For the actual rivets, the rivets I'll be using, they're 5mm long. They've got a small cap on them, and I know the fact that I need a 3mm hole for that. So I'm going to punch those in. Okay, and we're done with our punching really. Now it's a matter of adding the hardware. Before we do that, I'm going to now condition this leather and also bevel and slick the edges. Right, so next thing I want to do is actually bevel the edges. Well, while this leather's got some firmness about it, before I condition it, I like to do the edges. I'll do both sides. I'm going to use a number one edge beveler tool. This is a Palo Santo one. Of course, the different brands will have, different sizes, and a number one in this brand may not be a number one in some other brands. They tend to vary a lot. There's no particular standard. I know how much leather this takes off. I don't want to take too much off. It's just that it's only about 2mm of leather, or less. It's about 1.8. So I don't want to take too much off the edges, just to give it nice edge that we can then slick and round off and get them looking really nice. So I'm just going to do that next, and then we'll condition the leather. Beveling edges is another thing that you might want to practice on scrap bits of leather before you do it on a particular project you're working on. Like most things in leather craft, you want to practice the various techniques, so it builds your confidence that when you come to do it for real, you actually can do that and get a good job out of it. So that's the top part done. I'll also bevel the rough side. Again, I'm not taking a lot off here. But it's enough to get a nice edge ready for slicking later on. Okay, and we're pretty much done there. Looking good. Okay, so I'm going to now condition this leather. Now there's various ways of doing this, there's various products you can use. For this type of thing, I actually just like to use coconut oil, believe it or not. It's got to be 100% pure coconut oil. Some people like to use olive oil, for example. You don't need any particular special products, but there's all sorts of balms and leather conditioners you can use. And sometimes I apply oil, then a then a protective covering finish to seal the dye in and seal the leather, and then I can also apply another finish, a top coat finish on top of that. So there's various ways of doing it. For this, what I'm going to do is actually just apply a little bit of oil. That's the coconut oil. It will darken the leather and lighten up a little bit as it dries, but it will give it a nice rich look. Really brings out the real natural character of the leather. And you don't need too much, just so it's quite moist on top without it being saturated, and just gently massage that in. Okay, we just want to gently buff it, a round motion buffing type action, so that it actually absorbs that oil. I've actually just got a bit of scrap paper underneath it because I just don't like to get oil all over my stone here. Just keep things a little bit nice and neat and tidy. But that is looking fantastic. You could also, if you wanted to, oil the back side of it. I'm not going to do that. So as this now drying, what you can do is slowly move that leather around to start getting that suppleness back. By doing that, essentially it's like massaging the leather, and it will get that oil to absorb, move through the fibers. It'll take a little while, so that oil will take a little bit to absorb. Yeah, it will come up quite nice. I might just apply a little bit to the back on this occasion, just because it feels like it needs a little bit. And on the back, you really want to be very sparse with the oil. You don't want to go overboard. Just enough to get a bit of soaking going on. Like I said, there's many ways of conditioning leather. Get those oils back in. If you'd like to see me make a video of conditioning leather and the various products you can use and how I go about it, my particular techniques, just say so. And that goes for any other technique that you might want to know more about, whether it's stitching or beveling, cutting leather, which is a skill in itself. It looks easy when you've got quite a bit of experience, but even just cutting leather is a bit of a challenge and requires some practice and some basic techniques. Now this leather is now already feeling a lot more supple, and it will continue to soften up, and you can see it's a really beautiful rich colour now. That is really, really nice. Now there's a bit of a sheen on there that'll remain, but it won't be so prominent as that oil dries. I like to let it dry at least for 15 minutes, but an hour to 2 is actually even better. And as it's drying, every now and again I'll give it a bit of a massage. Okay, brings out the natural fibres, natural colours, and works that oil in, and you get a nice soft, supple product out of it. It's all these little things that make the difference in how your final product turns out and how people look at it, feel it, smell it, respond to it. It's all the little things that make the difference in the end. Okay, so off camera I've actually put in one set of snaps already, and there they are. Okay, locking in there. I've got another one to go. I thought there's no point showing you me doing both. I would just do one and then show the last one. Now I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about setting snaps or rivets or anything in this video. That really is the subject of a video in itself, quite frankly. But just so you get the general idea, you've got male and female end of snaps. These glove snaps have a particular method of being set, and you need the appropriate setters. This one's for the female end. Now we never want to apply too much pressure when we're setting snaps or rivets. We're better off just easy as we go so we don't damage anything. Check that we're not spinning. It seems quite quite solid. There's no spinning going on. That should hold quite nicely, and we can always test it, of course. Just as the point, you can see the nice, as I've been massaging that leather, as I was saying previously, and all, you can see the nice tones we're getting in that leather, darker and lighter browns, the natural grain coming out. It really is looking fantastic, this. Okay, so now the other side, which is the male end of the actual snap. We use a different setter for that. This one can be a bit tricky to get it right, but as I always say, start a few light taps. We want to test it out a bit. We want to make sure that we can't remove that. And then when we actually snap that together, move it around, make sure that nothing seems to be coming loose. Sometimes you'll find if you haven't set that right, it might pop out, especially that male end. And you can always just go back, just get a couple more taps. Again, never too severe. And you'll have some nice snaps that should never come out. Not that snaps are hard to replace, but you don't want things like that falling out. Generally, I find that once they're set right, they won't be going anywhere. So it's starting to take shape. We've got a nice little key case happening here. So the next step is to get the actual key holder in place. We'll need a couple of rivets. So I've got rivets here. I'm using, because I wanted rivets with a very small head, or the cap on them, so that they don't look too prominent on the outside here. I'm using single cap rivets. Just need to get the right end. So single cap rivets. You can use double caps. Double caps look a little bit nicer on the outside. However, sorry, I've got it the wrong way around. We should be putting these on the inside. And then it won't really matter because on the inside, I'm used to double caps. I don't use single caps too often. But I didn't have any double caps which had some nicer nice small caps on the end. I don't want really big caps on this end. It just doesn't look right. So sometimes these key holders actually come with their own rivets, and they are quite small. They're like these. Okay, they're very, very similar. I might actually use little anvil that you get with the setters for these, just because of the position of it. It's a bit fiddly. A little bit fiddly, but not too bad. I've got a rivet setter here. Great thing is if with a double head or double cap or single cap rivets is that once you pop that on, that's not going anywhere. In fact, what I normally do with rivets is push those through, push it through the hole if it wants to go. Just rushing here a bit, otherwise I normally would get this through a lot easier. Put those caps on, kind of snap in a little bit. Okay, so what it means is they won't fall out. They won't fall out now. You can work, you can set one at a time. Once they've kind of snapped in there, they're offset against the leather. There's a gap there, and now we'll actually go ahead and set those. But you can see how it's coming together quite nicely. So what I am going to do is use that anvil like so. Just want to make sure that your caps are straight, so that they sit nice and evenly. And just a couple of solid taps. That's all you need. That'll do it. Doesn't need anything more than that. So it's quite an easy process. Just a little bit fiddly. That's the sort of thing you get a feel for when you've done enough of them. You can see I'm not really hitting that setter too hard. And that's it, that's in now. That is in and ready. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, we have actually finished this. The one thing I'm going to do is just add a bit of like a sealing coat to the exposed leather part, so the inside and the outside. Before I do that, I'm actually going to slick my edges, and we'll go through that process in a minute. Okay, so I'm ready to burnish the edges now. We've beveled the edges. I don't want to get those nice and slick, take all the roughness out, so they look good, feel good, will last as well, and we'll seal those in a two-step process. There's lots of ways of slicking and burnishing edges, okay, so people tend to have their own techniques. It doesn't vary too much, but there are various ways you can do it. It really depends on the product you're using, the type of leather you're dealing with, etc. There's one thing about leather craft, there's always variation to the general theme, and you get to develop your own, I guess, favoured techniques for various things. So as a general rule for something like this, what I like to do is a two-step process. First of all, I like to apply just a little bit of water to the edges, just plain water. Okay. Allow that to dry a little bit, but not too much. So I might just do a couple of edges at a time. And for this, I'll use a slicker. And if you're new to this, basically what this is doing is, without pressing hard at all on that edge with a slicker, it's essentially creating friction, which brings up the oils in the leather and creates a nice smooth rounded edge. I don't like to do too much in this step with a water and wood slicker, just very gently. Just a very gentle slicking motion. I'm trying to press as lightly as I can. I don't want to press too hard on that leather, because what you'll do is you create like a lip over the top. Okay, so this one did dry out a bit. It really sucked in that water by the time I got round to it. So just a little bit more moisture, it'll start to give me a nice slick edge. A lot of this, there's no hard and fast rules. You tend to go by feel and experience. You tend to judge. Each piece of leather is different. Each project's slightly different. You can never apply the same formula necessary to every single project that you do, but the principles remain the same, of course. So I'm not sure if you can see on camera, but we're starting to get a nice slick edge there, as opposed to that edge there. Okay, I will show a close-up of that later on when the whole thing's finished. So we've got a couple of sides done. I'll do the other two. Again, as I said, I think I said before that this whole process of burnishing, beveling and preparing edges for burnishing and slicking, could be the subject of a whole video in itself, which I may well get around to doing one day. But I'm really liking the actual finish I'm getting on these edges at the moment. Looking very, very nice and shiny and slick. Last one. And you could have done this and the final top coat that I'm going to do after this, you could do that before you put your hardware on. Okay, normally I probably would have. It's just sometimes I end up doing things in a slightly different order, just for no particular reason. It just happens that way sometimes. As long as you're not doing something that really, really can't be done before or after the next step, it's not such a big deal. And sometimes you learn something by doing things like that out of the normal order of things. You think, well, I shouldn't have done that, or won't be doing that again, or hang on, that actually works quite well as an idea. I think I might try that again next time. So don't get too hung up about the order of things necessarily, but of course within reason. But I'm really liking the way these edges are coming up at the moment. Now we don't want to go too hard. We don't want mushy round, edges that sort of wavy. We want to maintain that as straight as we can. Okay, so I'm pretty much done with that step. I'll get the next product out and we'll go through that. Right, the next step in the finishing the edges process that I like to do is inside this bottle here, which has a fine needle point applicator. It is. I've got a product called Tokonol from Japan. I like to use. A lot of people use a gum tragacanth product. I actually prefer this. I think it's a much better product and it's a more natural product as well. It doesn't have the chemicals that the gum tragacanth has. For this, you can just use your finger again like I did with water and slick it on straight out of the container. I like using this because I don't like to get this product on. I try to avoid getting it on the actual leather itself. Okay, I've just got some water on here, so I might just wipe that down. That'll dry off anyway. Little drops of water on the leather don't stress me out too much. Now this allows me to put it on very accurately, and then I just use my finger to rub it. I'll show you the process. You probably can't see it in a lot of detail there, but you'll get the general gist. I'm just putting like little drops all along that edge, just every sort of 5 mil or so. Okay, and then with my finger I'll just work that around so it's covering that whole edge of that surface. Then what Tokonol likes in terms of working better is you just let it dry a bit. You don't want to start rubbing that off when it's too wet. For Tokonol I like to use a canvas cloth, okay, rather than the wood slicker. You can use wood slicker. I reckon the canvas cloth works really well. So just when it's starting to feel a bit tacky, I really just rub that off. Again, not pressing hard, it's just light, and just with that vigorous rubbing action, you create enough friction to really get that edge slicked up nicely. And there it is, it's really looking great. And what I find with the Tokonol and using the canvas cloth is that I really end up getting a nice round edge that way. The wood slicker, the water just starts that round edge, and then this really finishes it off to get a really nice finish. Okay, that's looking really, really nice. Really nice, that edge. Again, I'll do some close-ups later on when the whole thing's finished, so you can see the various, the stitching and the edges and everything else in a bit more detail. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you with it, showing you the whole Tokonol process on the edges. I'll do that off camera, and then we'll come back to putting the finishing coat on. Okay, time for the top coat, which really is the last part of this process here to finish this key case off. The various top coats you can use. I like to use this product called Tan Coat. It's actually very good. It seals the dye in, provides a protective coating, and as it dries, it's very clear and provides just a nice subtle sheen to the leather as well. Gives it a beautiful coat. Sometimes I even go as far as after that, once that's dried, say overnight, I'll even apply another leather balm coat over the top, depending on what I'm making. I think for this thing, just a tan coat will be fine. It's a very good product, but there's lots of different products out there. Everyone has their favourites that they like to use. So I've put some tan coat out into the lid, and just using a cloth, I'm just gonna. You don't want to apply too much tan coat, but just enough to get a good coverage. You'll have to work a little bit more on the actual rough side of the leather. The smooth side, obviously, the top grain is a lot easier. This really, what I find also with tan coat is that this rough side of the leather, it will smooth it out. If there's sometimes it can be a bit rough. It will actually smooth that rough side out a bit to give a nice, smooth, glossy look. It really provides a nice a nice finish to the leather product on both the rough side and to the actual top grain of the leather as well. And you can see I'm not putting too much. You don't need a lot of tan coat, and it will look quite glossy when it first goes on and darken the leather a bit. As it dries, it loses a lot of that gloss and goes a bit lighter again, back to the leather colour, and it just provides a nice subtle sheen rather than a strong glossy look. Okay, so I just want to make sure I get all those little nooks and crannies. Again, you could do this before you put your hardware on. Sometimes I do. It depends what I'm making. Some things is more critical than others. For this particular key case, it's not so critical. You can get away with doing it in either order. It doesn't matter too much. You know, and also cover those stitches up. It'll provide a nice protective coating for the stitches. You finish a product you build a product like this well and you finish it well, it's something to last a very long time, very, very long time. You've looked after perhaps a couple of decades or more. Okay, so I've done the rough side. That's looking really good. That'll dry off nicely. Now I'll apply some of this to the actual, the outside, the top grain. Spread it out, but try not to, with products like tan coat, try not to actually do like a buffing motion. You really just want to apply that and then let it naturally dry, okay, rather than trying to buff it in or anything like that, like a lot of sort of leather balms and that type of thing. You don't need to do that. In fact, it works better if you don't. Again, always when you're using new top coats or any sort of finishes, just experiment perhaps on a piece of scrap leather, see what it looks like, see if you like it before actually using it on a finished product. Now it looks a little bit rough when it first goes on. You probably can't see on camera too much. There's a few marks and whatever. Looks a bit uneven, but what will happen is as it dries, that'll come up really, really nice. Just like to make sure I get all nooks and crannies. And in hindsight, with this hardware on there, I probably should have done it before I put the hardware on, but that's okay. It'll work just fine. Okay, I've probably rubbed that a bit more than I normally would. You can get sort of dry side. If there looks like to be a bit of excess, get a bit of the dry side of the cloth, the clean part of it, and just dab at it, just get any sort of real excess off. Now we can allow that to dry. You can see it's got a nice sheen to it. As that dries, it's going to come up really, really nice. It'll look quite beautiful actually. Okay, so here's the final product. It's come up very nice indeed, in fact. Here's one I made a little while ago. Dyed black. Belongs to my wife. She ended up taking this one. She liked the look of it. So you can achieve different looks. The stitching's a little bit different colour on that. On the black one, looks quite good. Just goes to show you what you can make, and that's the point, with a very simple pattern and a very simple piece of leather that we cut out. Some readily available hardware. We can produce a very professional, slick-looking product such as this key case. And if I bring that a bit closer, you can see what I mean by the stitching in particular. How even though it's not really required, it's really just there as a cosmetic thing. It really does give it that more professional, polished look. And you can see the nice tones in that leather. You know, some of the natural grain coming out. Tones that are lighter brown to through to darker brown. Which gives it that nice, more rustic sort of look than the black one. And the other point is, of course, that we can use, even though it's a very simple item that we've made here, it allowed us to practice things like cutting leather, which is a skill in itself, dyeing, conditioning and finish coat, application of those. It allowed us to do stitching, practice that, setting rivets and snaps. So there's quite a few fundamental skills that a simple pattern like this allows us to practice and get better and better at, and so we can tackle more complex projects. It's all about building up the skills over time. So I hope you enjoyed watching how that key case was made. Remember to subscribe and leave me some comments below in terms of any suggestions you might have for future videos I might make, particularly specific techniques, whether it's stitching or setting of rivets, that type of thing, the dyeing process, all those sorts of techniques that go into making something like this, and also more complex. Happy to hear any ideas, and perhaps I can actually endeavour to make some videos to address those suggestions. Thanks for watching.